September 26th, 20. Detective Dan Jackson stood at the podium, his right arm still bearing scars from a shotgun blast that nearly ended his career 8 months earlier. Behind him, projected on a massive screen, was a face the families had waited 34 years to see. Robert Eugene Brashers, high school chemistry teacher, Little League coach, Citizen of the Year 1997, and the man who murdered 4 teenage girls in an Austin yogurt shop on December selenite. The press conference room erupted. How had a respected educator committed one of Texas's most brutal crimes and remained undetected for decades? How many of his students had sat in his classroom, never knowing their teacher was a serial killer? And most chilling of all, why did it take 34 years, 2 wrongful convictions, and a detective who refused to quit even after being shot, to finally bring him to justice? Before we dive into this haunting case, take a second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This investigation spans 3 decades, involves wrongful convictions, DNA technology that didn't exist when the murders occurred, and a serial killer who took his own secrets to the grave. Or so he thought. Where are you watching from today? Whether you're in Austin, where this nightmare unfolded, or thousands of miles away. This case reminds us that evil can wear any face, strike anywhere, and the pursuit of justice never truly ends. Drop a comment below with your location. Let's build a community of truth seekers together. And if you're watching this late at night like I was when I first researched this case, what time is it where you are? Something about these cold cases hits different in the dark hours, doesn't it? Now, let's go back to where it all began. A Friday night in December 1991, when 4 girls walked into a yogurt shop for the last time. December 6th, 1991, Austin, Texas. The Christmas shopping season was in full swing, and the North Cross Mall area buzzed with the kind of energy that only comes in those precious weeks before the holidays. 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison was finishing up her closing shift at the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop, located in a small strip mall on Anderson Lane. Her co-worker that evening was Eliza Thomas, also 17, a bright student who'd taken the job to save money for college. The 2 girls had become fast friends, bonding over homework during slow shifts and making plans for their futures that would be stolen from them in just a few hours. At approximately 10:00 p.m., Jennifer's 15-year-old sister, Sarah, arrived at the shop. Their mother, Barbara Wilson Ayers, had arranged for Jennifer to give Sarah a ride home after closing. With Sarah came her friend, 13-year-old Amy Ayers, a girl who loved horses, who had her whole life ahead of her, who would never make it home that night. The 4 girls chatted and laughed as Jennifer and Eliza went through the closing procedures. They cleaned the counters, counted the register, restocked supplies. Normal, mundane tasks. The kind of work teenagers do in part-time jobs across America every single night. But someone was watching them, according to witness statements collected that night and in the days following. Approximately 1 hour before closing time, around 10:00 p.m., a man entered the yogurt shop and asked to use the bathroom. This was not unusual. The shop's restroom was accessible to customers. The man disappeared into the back area where the bathroom was located. What the girls didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that this man may have been casing the shop, studying the layout, planning his attack. Some investigators would later theorize that he jammed open a rear exit door during this visit, creating his entry point for later. At approximately 10:50 p.m., just 10 minutes before the shop's 11:00 p.m. closing time, another crucial witness emerged. A couple who had been sitting in the shop, enjoying their frozen yogurt and chatting, stood up to leave as Jennifer began her final closing duties. As they walked out the front door, they noticed something that would haunt them for years. Two men sitting at a back table, acting strangely. The couple later described the men as furtive, nervous, out of place. One was watching the clock. The other kept glancing toward the back area, toward that bathroom, toward that potentially compromised rear door. The couple left. They were the last known customers to see the four girls alive. What happened in the next 47 minutes would shock a nation and launch one of the most intensive criminal investigations in Texas history. At 11:47 p.m., an Austin Police Department patrol officer driving past the strip mall noticed flames inside the "I can't believe it's yogurt" shop. He immediately radioed for fire and rescue. Within minutes, firefighters arrived and began battling the blaze. The fire was intense, concentrated, deliberate. This was no accident. Someone had used an accelerant, possibly yogurt shop cleaning supplies, to ensure maximum destruction. Someone wanted to destroy evidence. As firefighters pushed into the smoke-filled building, extinguishing hot spots and checking for structural damage, one of them made a discovery that would forever change Austin. In the back room, in the shop's storage cooler, he found the body of a young girl. Then another, then another, then a fourth. All four teenagers were found nude, their hands bound behind their backs with their own clothing. Their mouths had been gagged with fabric torn from their garments. Each girl had been shot in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. But Amy Ayers, the youngest at just 13 years old, had suffered an additional wound. She'd also been shot with a .380 caliber handgun. The positioning of the bodies suggested something even more disturbing. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a panicked shooting. The killer had taken his time. He had controlled 4 victims simultaneously, a feat that required planning, experience, and a chilling level of confidence. 3 of the 4 girls showed evidence of sexual assault. The killer had violated them, executed them, and then tried to burn away the evidence of his crimes. Austin Police Department detectives arrived within the hour. The scene was catastrophic. The fire had destroyed much of the physical evidence. In 1991, forensic science was nowhere near what it is today. DNA analysis was still in its infancy. The investigators knew they were fighting an uphill battle, but they also knew they couldn't fail these girls. They couldn't fail their families. They couldn't fail their city. By dawn on December 7th, 1991, the news had spread across Austin like wildfire. 4 teenage girls murdered in a yogurt shop, shot execution style, sexually assaulted. The crime was so brutal, so shocking, that it shattered the sense of safety that Austin residents had always taken for granted. Parents held their children closer. Teenagers stopped taking closing shifts at retail jobs. The city that prided itself on being weird, quirky, safe, Austin had lost its innocence overnight. Detective John Jones was assigned as one of the lead investigators. He would later describe the scene as the worst thing I'd ever witnessed in 20 years of police work. The bodies of the girls had been subjected to such violence, such degradation, that even hardened homicide detectives struggled to process what they were seeing. But they had a job to do. They had families waiting for answers. They had a killer to catch. The investigation began immediately. Police collected every piece of physical evidence they could salvage from the fire-damaged scene. They found the spent .22 caliber shell casings. They found 1 critical .380 caliber casing in the floor drain, a piece of evidence that wouldn't reveal its importance for another 34 years. They collected DNA samples from the victims, particularly focusing on evidence of sexual assault. In 1991, this meant preservation more than analysis. The technology simply wasn't advanced enough yet to extract usable profiles from degraded samples. Detectives also began the painstaking process of interviewing witnesses. The couple who had left just before closing gave detailed descriptions of the two suspicious men at the back table. Other customers from earlier in the evening were tracked down and questioned. Employees who had worked previous shifts were interviewed. Anyone who had been in or near the strip mall that night became a person of interest. The scope was massive. The pressure was crushing. Within days, the tip line was flooded. Thousands upon thousands of calls poured in. People reported suspicious neighbors, ex-boyfriends with violent tendencies, strangers they'd seen lurking near yogurt shops. Psychics called with visions. Conspiracy theorists called with elaborate scenarios. And then there were the confessions, dozens of them. People confessing to crimes they didn't commit, seeking attention, seeking infamy, seeking something investigators couldn't begin to understand. Every tip had to be followed. Every confession had to be verified and, ultimately, dismissed. The funerals were held in the days following the murders. Amy Ayers' service was attended by hundreds, classmates, teachers, family members, whose lives would never be the same. Eliza Thomas was remembered as a brilliant student with a bright future. Jennifer and Sarah Harbison were mourned together, two sisters stolen from their family in a single night of horror. Their mother, Barbara Wilson Ayers, stood at their graves and made a promise. She would never stop fighting for justice. She would never let the world forget her daughters. The investigation continued through Christmas 1991, into the new year, through all of 1992. Detectives followed more than 124 separate leads. They interviewed 201 individuals. They collected DNA samples from dozens of potential suspects. They analyzed ballistic evidence, fire patterns, witness statements. They built timelines, created psychological profiles, consulted with FBI experts on serial offenders. And they came up with nothing. No solid suspect. No breakthrough. The case was going cold. By September 1992, 9 months after the murders, the Austin Police Department made the difficult decision to reclassify the yogurt shop murders as a cold case. Active investigation would continue, but the daily intensity, the round-the-clock detective work, it had to scale back. There were other crimes, other victims, other cases demanding attention. But the 4 girls were never forgotten. Their case files remained open. Their evidence remained preserved, waiting for the day when technology might catch up to justice. What time is it where you're watching? Are you staying up late? Going down this true crime rabbit hole with me? There's something about these cases that keeps us searching for answers, isn't there? Hit that like button if you're committed to seeing this through to the end, and drop a comment telling me, did you remember hearing about this case when it happened? Or is this the first time you're learning about the yogurt shop murders? For those of us who were around in 1991, this case marked something. A moment when we realized that evil doesn't announce itself, doesn't look like a monster, can strike in the most ordinary places. 7 years passed. 7 years of Barbara Wilson Ayers visiting her daughter's graves. 7 years of Sean Ayers growing up without his little sister Amy. 7 years of Austin living with an unsolved quadruple homicide hanging over the city like a dark cloud. 7 years of a killer walking free, potentially committing more crimes, more murders, more devastation that no one had yet connected. Then, in October 1999, the case exploded back into the headlines. Austin Police Department detectives, under intense pressure from the community and from the victims' families, decided to take another run at the case. They brought in fresh eyes, new investigators who hadn't been burned out by the initial investigation's dead ends. And these new detectives started looking at old tips with fresh perspectives, particularly focusing on a confession that had come in just 8 days after the murders, a confession that had been initially dismissed, but perhaps deserved another look. On December 14, 1991, just 8 days after the yogurt shop murders, a 16-year-old boy named Morris Pierce had walked into a police station with a story. He told detectives that he had information about the murders. He said his friend, Forrest Wellborn, had borrowed a .22 caliber pistol from him. He said Wellborn had later confessed to him that he and some other friends had committed the yogurt shop murders. Pierce named names: Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, 4 teenage boys, supposedly responsible for one of the most brutal crimes in Texas history. In 1991, detectives had interviewed all 4 boys. They'd looked into Pierce's claims, and they'd eliminated them as suspects. The timeline didn't match. The descriptions from witnesses didn't match. There was no physical evidence. The confession seemed like another attention-seeking fabrication in a case that had attracted dozens of false confessions. The boys were cleared, and the investigation moved on. But in 1999, a new team of detectives revisited Pierce's statement. They brought Maurice Pierce back in for questioning. They brought in Forrest Wellborn, now 24 years old. They brought in Robert Springsteen, 24. They brought in Michael Scott, 26. And they started applying pressure, the kind of pressure that would later be recognized as psychologically coercive, but at the time seemed like aggressive, necessary police work on a case that desperately needed solving. Over the course of multiple interrogation sessions, something remarkable happened. Robert Springsteen confessed. Then Michael Scott confessed. 2 men, now adults, admitted to participating in the yogurt shop murders when they were teenagers. They provided details about the crime scene, details that prosecutors would later argue only the killers could have known. They implicated each other. They described binding the girls, shooting them, setting the fire. Under intense questioning, separated from lawyers and family, worn down by hours of interrogation, both men confessed to capital murder. On October 6, 1999, all 4 men were arrested and charged with capital murder in the yogurt shop case. Maurice Pierce, Forrest Wellborn, Robert Springsteen, and Michael Scott. 4 names that would become synonymous with the case. 4 lives that would be forever altered by accusations of a crime they did not commit. The community reaction was immediate and intense. Finally, justice. Finally, answers. Finally, the monsters who had murdered 4 innocent girls would pay for their crimes. News helicopters circled the Travis County Jail. Reporters swarmed the courthouse. The victims' families, exhausted from 8 years of waiting, allowed themselves to hope that closure might finally be within reach. But from the very beginning, problems emerged with the prosecution's case. Forrest Wellborn never confessed. Despite hours of interrogation, despite the pressure, despite being told that his friends had implicated him, Wellborn maintained his innocence. He refused to sign a confession. He demanded a lawyer. And eventually, the evidence against him was so thin that a grand jury refused to indict him. Charges against Forrest Wellborn were dropped in early 2000. Maurice Pierce's charges were also dropped. His role had been as an informant, someone who claimed secondhand knowledge. Without direct physical evidence or a confession, prosecutors couldn't build a case against him. By mid-2000, only 2 men remained charged with the yogurt shop murders: Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott. The trials began in 2001. Robert Springsteen was tried first. The prosecution's case relied heavily on his videotaped confession, a confession he now recanted, claiming it had been coerced, that detectives had fed him crime scene information, that he'd been young and scared and told them what they wanted to hear. But juries trust confessions. despite the absence of any physical evidence linking Springsteen to the yogurt shop. No DNA, no fingerprints, no witness identification. The jury convicted him of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. Michael Scott's trial followed. Like Springsteen, Scott had confessed and then recanted. Like Springsteen, there was no physical evidence against him. But the prosecution had an ace. They could use Springsteen's confession to corroborate Scott's confession. Each man had implicated the other. Each man's statement supported the other's guilt. The jury convicted Michael Scott of capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the families, it was supposed to be over. 2 men convicted, 2 men sent to prison for horrific crimes. Justice served. But even in that moment of supposed closure, doubt lingered. Why was there no physical evidence? How had 2 teenage boys managed to control and murder 4 victims with such precision? Why did the crime scene suggest experienced offenders, not panicked teenagers? And most troubling of all, why didn't the DNA match? Because here's what the public didn't fully understand in 2001. Investigators had collected male DNA from the yogurt shop crime scene, specifically from the sexual assault evidence. In 1999, when Springsteen and Scott were arrested, that DNA was tested against their profiles using the technology available at the time, and it didn't match, not even close. But prosecutors argued that in a chaotic crime scene with multiple perpetrators, it was possible the DNA came from an unidentified 5th suspect. The jury accepted this explanation. The conviction stood. For 8 years, Robert Springsteen sat on death row at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, maintaining his innocence, waiting for execution. For 8 years, Michael Scott served his life sentence, writing letters to lawyers, to journalists, to anyone who might listen to his claims of innocence. And for 8 years, DNA technology continued to advance. In 2004, a U.S. Supreme Court decision in the case of Crawford v. Washington changed the rules on hearsay evidence in criminal trials. Specifically, the ruling held that prosecutors couldn't use one defendant's confession against another defendant without the opportunity for cross-examination. This was exactly what had happened in the Scott and Springsteen trials. Each man's confession had been used to corroborate the other's guilt, but neither defendant had been able to cross-examine the other. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals applied this ruling to Scott and Springsteen's cases, overturning both convictions and ordering new trials. It should have been a straightforward retrial. Same evidence, same confessions, same arguments, just without the constitutional error that had tainted the original convictions. But as prosecutors from the Travis County District Attorney's Office prepared for the new trials in 2009, DNA technology presented them with a devastating problem. In 2008 and 2009, the male DNA evidence from the yogurt shop crime scene was retested using advanced Y-YSTR, Y chromosome short tandem repeat analysis. This technology, unavailable during the original 1991 investigation, could extract detailed genetic profiles from degraded samples. The results were unambiguous. The DNA did not match Robert Springsteen. It did not match Michael Scott. It did not match Maurice Pierce or Forrest Wellborn. The DNA belonged to an unknown male who had never been identified. On October 28, 2009, Travis County prosecutors made the extraordinary decision to drop all charges against Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott. After nearly 10 years, 8 years of Springsteen's life spent on death row, 8 years of Scott's life spent in a maximum security prison, both men were released. They walked out of custody as free men, but their lives had been irrevocably destroyed. Springsteen had lost his 20s. Scott had lost his 20s. Both had lost their reputations, their futures, their trust in the justice system. They were innocent, but they would never get those years back. The victims' families were devastated. Not because they wanted innocent men punished. They had never wanted that. But because it meant the real killer was still out there. It meant the investigation was back to square one. It meant that for nearly 2 decades, while police pursued the wrong suspects, the actual murderer had remained free. How many more victims might there have been in those years? How many more lives destroyed? And so the yogurt shop murders returned to cold case status. The investigation technically remained open, but with no active suspects, no new leads, and a community exhausted by false hope and wrongful convictions, the case seemed destined to join the ranks of America's most infamous, unsolved crimes. Before we continue, I want you to think about what you would do if you were assigned this case. 30 years of dead ends. Wrongful convictions that destroyed trust in the investigation. Families desperate for answers. Evidence degraded by fire and time. What's the weather like where you are today? For me, researching this case on cold winter nights, I kept thinking about those December nights in 1991 and 2009, moments when everything seemed hopeless, when justice seemed impossible. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had to solve an impossible problem? How did you approach it? Because that's exactly what the next detective in our story had to figure out. Dan Jackson grew up just 30 miles south of Austin. He was born in 1982, making him only 9 years old when the yogurt shop murders occurred. But like every kid in the Austin area, he heard about the case. It was part of the local mythology, whispered about on playgrounds, discussed in hushed tones when adults thought children weren't listening. 4 girls, murdered in a yogurt shop. The killer never found. The moment Austin lost its innocence, Jackson became a police officer because he wanted to help people, wanted to bring order to chaos, wanted to be the kind of person who stood between the innocent and the evil that lurked in society's shadows. He joined the Austin Police Department and worked his way through patrol, through various investigative units, building a reputation as thorough, dedicated, and stubborn in the best possible way. When a case landed on his desk, he didn't let go until he'd exhausted every avenue. In 2022, Jackson was promoted to lead the Austin Police Department's ColdCase unit. It was a prestigious assignment, overseeing investigations into some of the city's most notorious unsolved murders. On his first day in the new position, his supervisor called him into the office and closed the door. Jackson wondered if he'd done something wrong already, if the promotion had been a mistake. Instead, his supervisor looked him in the eye and said, "I need you to solve the yogurt shop murders." Jackson felt the weight of that assignment immediately. This wasn't just another cold case. This was the cold case, the one that had consumed investigators' careers, the one that had resulted in wrongful convictions, the one that families had been waiting 31 years to see resolved. If he solved it, he'd be a hero. If he failed, he'd be adding his name to a long list of detectives who'd tried and come up short. I realized then the seriousness of the case and how significant it would be for the rest of my career, Jackson would later recall. Even if we solve it, I will always carry this with me. Jackson began by doing what any good detective does. He went back to the beginning. He reviewed every page of the case file, which by 2022 had grown to thousands of pages. He studied the original crime scene photos, the witness statements, the forensic reports. He familiarized himself with every failed lead, every wrong turn, every theory that had been pursued and abandoned over 3 decades. He needed to understand not just what had been done, But what hadn't been done? What new avenues might exist that previous investigators hadn't explored? One thing became clear to Jackson very quickly. The DNA evidence was key. The YSTR profile of the unknown male from the crime scene had been sitting in evidence for years, but it had never been matched to anyone in CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. The profile was too unique, too degraded, or the perpetrator simply wasn't in the database. But DNA technology had continued to advance since 2009. New techniques, new databases, new possibilities existed in 2022 that hadn't existed 13 years earlier. Jackson also recognized something that would become crucial. This process required collaboration. One police department, even one as large as Austin PD, couldn't solve this alone. He began reaching out to federal agencies, to forensic laboratories across the country, to ColdCase units in other states. He wanted to know if there were any unsolved cases with similar MOs. Binding victims with their own clothing, sexual assault, followed by execution-style shootings, attempts to destroy evidence with fire. Serial offenders often have signatures, patterns they can't help but repeat. If this killer had struck before or after the yogurt shop murders, there might be evidence out there waiting to be connected. In 2023, Jackson's investigation, and his life, hit a devastating setback. On August 6, 2023, while volunteering for a patrol shift to stay connected with street-level police work, Jackson responded to a call involving an armed suspect. The situation escalated rapidly. The suspect opened fire with a 12-gauge shotgun at close range, approximately 10 feet. Jackson was hit primarily in his right arm, with additional injuries to his face from the shotgun blast. The injuries were severe. Jackson underwent emergency surgery, followed by months of physical rehabilitation. For most people, this would have been a career-ending event, a trauma that would push them toward early retirement and a quiet life away from police work. But Jackson wasn't most people. As soon as he was cleared for light duty, he returned to work, and he returned to the yogurt shop case. While he couldn't conduct interviews or perform strenuous investigative activities himself, he delegated tasks to colleagues, followed up on leads from his desk, and kept pushing the investigation forward. "You just keep pushing forward," he said simply, as if being shot, and then immediately resuming work on a 32-year-old cold case was the most natural thing in the world. By late June 2024, Jackson had recovered sufficiently to dive back into active investigation. He made a decision that would change everything. He ordered new testing on a piece of evidence that hadn't been reanalyzed in years, the spent .380 caliber bullet casing found in the yogurt shop's floor drain back in 1991. Here's what Jackson knew. The 4 girls had all been shot in the head with a .22 caliber firearm. But Amy Ayers, the youngest victim at 13, had also been shot with a .380 caliber weapon. That .380 casing found in the drain represented a unique piece of evidence. While .22 caliber firearms are incredibly common, making it difficult to trace specific weapons, .380 semi-automatic pistols leave more distinctive markings on spent casings. Every firearm leaves a unique fingerprint on bullets and casings it fires, microscopic markings created by the gun's chamber, firing pin, and ejector. If that same .380 pistol had been used in another crime, ballistic analysis might create a link. Jackson submitted the .380 casing to NIBIN, the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, which functions like CODIS for shell casings instead of DNA. It's a database maintained by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, that catalogs ballistic evidence from crimes across the United States. The system uses advanced imaging technology to compare microscopic markings on bullet casings, searching for matches that might connect different crimes to the same weapon. On July 2, 2024, Jackson was on a family vacation. On a beach, trying to relax and spend time with his wife and children. His cell phone rang. It was an AIF agent. "Do you have a pen in your pocket?" the agent asked. "Yes," Jackson replied, confused. "Good. You're going to need it. We got a hit." Jackson's heart rate skyrocketed. A hit. After 33 years, they had a connection. The .380 casing from the Austin yogurt shop murders matched the ballistic evidence from an unsolved murder in Kentucky from 1998. The same gun had been used in both crimes. Jackson immediately contacted Kentucky law enforcement. The details of the Kentucky case were eerily similar to the yogurt shop murders. A female victim, sexual assault, binding, execution-style shooting, attempts to destroy evidence. The modus operandi was virtually identical. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a serial offender. This was someone who had killed multiple times, in multiple states, using the same weapon and the same methods. But they still didn't have a name. The Kentucky case, like the Austin case, remained unsolved. The ballistic match proved the crimes were connected, but it didn't identify the perpetrator. Jackson needed more. He doubled down on the DNA evidence. He sent requests to every law enforcement agency and forensic laboratory in the United States that maintained YSTR DNA databases, asking if they could manually compare their profiles against the unknown male DNA from the yogurt shop case. Most agencies declined. The process is time-consuming and resource-intensive, and without a strong lead suggesting which database might contain a match. It's like searching for a needle in a continental haystack. But on August 22, 2024, Jackson received a call from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division's forensic laboratory. They had a match, a complete YSTR profile match to an unsolved murder from 1990 in Greenville, South Carolina. The case file from Greenville sent chills down Jackson's spine. The victim was a young woman who had been raped and murdered. She had been bound with her own clothing. She had been shot execution style. The similarities to the yogurt shop murders were undeniable. And now Jackson had a name: Robert Eugene Brashers. Jackson immediately ran a background check on Brashers. What he discovered was horrifying. Robert Eugene Brashers was a serial killer and serial rapist with a documented criminal history dating back to at least 19. His first known violent crime occurred on November 22, 1885, in Port St. Lucie, Florida. Brashers had picked up a 24-year-old woman named Michelle Wilkerson, taken her to a secluded area, and when she rejected his sexual advances, he shot her twice in the head and neck. Miraculously, Wilkerson survived. She managed to crawl away, hide in a culvert, and eventually get help. Her testimony put Brashers in prison for attempted first-degree murder. Brashers was sentenced to 12 years, but under Florida's more lenient sentencing laws at the time, he was released on parole after serving just 4 years. He walked out of prison on May 1989. Less than 2 years later, he murdered the woman in Greenville, South Carolina. 7 months after that, he murdered 4 girls in Austin, Texas. And he didn't stop there. As Jackson dug deeper into Brashers' history, more victims emerged. In March 1997, Brashers raped a 14-year-old girl in Memphis, Tennessee, after forcing his way into her home at gunpoint and tying up everyone inside. In March 1998, Brashers committed a double homicide in Portageville, Missouri. 38-year-old Sherry Scherer and her 12-year-old daughter Megan were found shot to death in their home, both tied up, the young girl raped before being murdered with a .22 caliber gun, the same caliber used in the yogurt shop murders. Approximately 2 hours after the Scherer murders, Brashers broke into another home in Dyersburg, Tennessee, and attempted to assault a woman there. That victim fought back fiercely, and Brashers fled. But ballistic evidence confirmed the same gun had been used. Robert Eugene Brashers was a monster, a predator who targeted women and children, who bound them, violated them, executed them, and moved from state to state, leaving a trail of devastation that law enforcement agencies had never connected, because he used multiple aliases, changed his appearance, and died before modern DNA technology could link his crimes. Because here's the final piece. Robert Eugene Brashers died on January 19, 1999. He committed suicide during a police standoff in Missouri, using a gun to shoot himself rather than face capture. He was 40 years old. He took his secrets to the grave, or so everyone thought at the time. It was only years later, as DNA technology advanced and cold case investigators like Jackson refused to give up, that Brashers' crimes were finally being connected, his victims finally being identified, his legacy of horror finally being exposed. Jackson now had a suspect, but he needed proof. He needed direct physical evidence linking Brashers to the yogurt shop murders. The YSTR DNA profile was compelling, but it wasn't definitive enough for absolute certainty. YSTR analysis examines only the male Y chromosome, which is passed down from father to son with minimal variation, meaning that male relatives can have very similar or identical YSTR profiles. Jackson needed something more concrete. There was one piece of evidence that had never been fully tested, a piece of evidence so crucial that previous investigators had been reluctant to use it because the DNA would be depleted during testing. Fingernail clippings from Amy Ayers' autopsy. When the 13-year-old girl was murdered, the medical examiner had carefully collected clippings from under her fingernails. There was evidence Amy had fought her attacker, scratching at him, trying to defend herself. Under those nails might be her killer's DNA, not just YSTR, but a full autosomal DNA profile that could definitively identify Brashers. Jackson made the call. Test the fingernails. Go all in. Deplete the evidence if necessary, but get the answer. On September 15, 2024, the fingernail clippings were sent for advanced DNA analysis. The unknown male D found under Amy's fingernails was directly compared to Robert Eugene Brashers' known DNA profile, a profile that had been collected years earlier when Brashers was exhumed from his grave in Arkansas for DNA sampling related to other cold cases. The results came back. A match. A definitive, scientifically certain match. The DNA under Amy Ayers' fingernails belonged to Robert Eugene Brashers. Statistical analysis indicated a 2 to 1 probability, meaning there was a 1 in 2 million chance the DNA came from someone other than Brashers. In forensic science, that's as close to absolute certainty as it's possible to achieve. Jackson had solved the yogurt shop murders. After 34 years, after multiple failed investigations, after wrongful convictions and shattered lives, after a serial killer had been in his grave for a quarter century, Detective Dan Jackson had identified the man responsible for one of the most horrific crimes in Texas history. But the investigation wasn't finished. Because now Jackson had another question. Where had Brashers been after the yogurt shop murders? And was there any evidence placing him in Austin at the time of the crime? A deep dive into Brashers' movements in December 1991 provided the final, chilling confirmation. On December 8, 1991, just 48 hours after the yogurt shop murders, Robert Eugene Brashers was stopped by the Texas Highway Patrol at the Texas-New Mexico border near El Paso. He was driving a stolen vehicle, and he was carrying a .380 caliber semi-automatic pistol. The firearm was confiscated as evidence of auto theft. Brashers posted bail and disappeared before trial, skipping out on the charges. The gun went into an evidence locker in El Paso, sitting there for decades, forgotten. But when Jackson requested ballistic analysis on that confiscated .380, the results were conclusive. It was the same model that had fired the .380 bullet that killed Amy Ayers. The microscopic markings on test fires from that specific weapon matched the markings on the casing found in the yogurt shop's floor drain. Robert Eugene Brashers had murdered 4 girls in Austin on December 6, 1991. He had driven west, fleeing the state. He was caught with the murder weapon 2 days later. And because of a clerical error, because of bureaucratic inefficiency, because of the chaos of overlapping jurisdictions, because of simple bad luck, he was released on bail and vanished, free to kill again and again until he finally took his own life, 8 years later. Take a moment and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. This story is almost over, but the implications are staggering. Drop a comment. What do you think should happen when cases like this reveal systemic failures? How many victims might have been saved if Brashers had been identified in 1991? On September 26, 2020, the Austin Police Department held a press conference that would finally bring closure to one of the most haunting cases in American criminal history. Detective Dan Jackson stood at the podium, flanked by Austin Police Chief Lisa Davis, Travis County District Attorney Jose Garza, and representatives from multiple law enforcement agencies that had collaborated on the investigation. After 34 years, Chief Davis began, the Austin Police Department has achieved a substantial breakthrough in one of the most tragic and haunting cases in our city's history. Jackson then presented the evidence: the DNA match, the ballistic analysis, the timeline placing Brashers in Austin on December 6, 1991, and fleeing the state with the murder weapon 2 days later, the connections to multiple other murders and sexual assaults across the southeastern United States. The picture was complete, comprehensive, devastating. I'm completely convinced that this is Robert Eugene Brashers, Jackson stated with absolute certainty. In the audience sat the families who had waited 34 years for this moment. Barbara Wilson Ayers, mother of Jennifer and Sarah Harbison, now in her 70s, listened as the detective explained how her daughters had died and who had killed them. Sean Ayers, who had been 19 years old when his little sister Amy was murdered, sat beside his wife Angie, holding her hand as they processed the magnitude of what they were hearing. Bob Ayers, Amy's father, had brought something with him to the press conference, a commemorative pin created by the victims' families shortly after the 1991 murders. The pins had circulated around Austin for years, worn by police officers and community members as a promise and a reminder. The pin read, "We will not forget." As Jackson finished his presentation, Bob Ayers walked up to the detective and carefully pinned the commemorative badge to Jackson's lapel. It was one of the original pins, worn for 34 years, passed between family members who refused to give up hope. And now it belonged to the detective who had finally delivered on that promise. That is one of the original pins made, and he truly deserves it, Sean Ayers said later. It may not seem like much, but to us, it means everything. But the press conference also included another critical moment, a moment of reckoning for the justice system that had failed so spectacularly in 1999. Travis County District Attorney Jose Garza stepped to the microphone and addressed the 4 men who had been wrongfully arrested, interrogated, charged, and in 2 cases convicted and imprisoned for crimes they did not commit. There are still investigative steps that are underway, Garza said carefully. That being said, the overwhelming weight of the evidence points to the guilt of 1 man and the innocence of 4. If the conclusions of that investigation are confirmed, The Travis County District Attorney's Office will take responsibility for our role in prosecuting these men, in sending one to death row and one to serve life in prison. If the conclusions of APD's investigations are confirmed, as it appears that they will be, I will say I am sorry, though I know that will never be enough. It was an extraordinary public apology, the kind rarely seen from prosecutors. But Garza understood what many in law enforcement are reluctant to acknowledge. Wrongful convictions don't just harm the innocent people imprisoned. They allow real killers to remain free, to victimize others, to destroy more lives. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott had lost nearly a decade of their lives to wrongful imprisonment. During those years, while police focused on the wrong suspects, Robert Eugene Brashers continued his reign of terror across multiple states. The families, to their immense credit, expressed no anger toward the wrongfully convicted men. Barbara Wilson Ayers addressed this directly. We never wanted anyone to go to jail or be charged with anything that they did not do. Vengeance was never it. It was always the truth. That commitment to truth, rather than vengeance, is perhaps the most powerful legacy of this case. The families could have clung to the false certainty of the 1999 convictions. They could have resisted the DNA evidence that exonerated Springsteen and Scott. They could have demanded that anyone be punished, innocent or not, just to have someone held accountable. Instead, they waited. They trusted the process. They believed that eventually the truth would emerge, and it did. In the weeks following the press conference, more details about Robert Eugene Brashers' criminal history came to light. Investigators across the country began reviewing their own unsolved cases, looking for connections to Brashers. The 1998 Kentucky murder, previously linked only by ballistics, was now officially attributed to him. Multiple rape cases from the 1990s were being re-examined. Brashers is now believed to be responsible for at least 8 murders and numerous sexual assaults across Florida, South Carolina, Tennessee, Missouri, Texas, and Kentucky. Steve Kramer, a former FBI attorney who pioneered the use of investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, in criminal cases. The same technique that famously solved the Golden State Killer case in 2018 joined the yogurt shop investigation in 2023 to assist Jackson's team. Kramer emphasized that the resolution of this case required a combination of old and new forensic techniques: traditional CODIS DNA analysis, Y chromosome STR profiling, genetic genealogy, ballistics analysis through NIBIN, and meticulous detective work connecting records across multiple decades and jurisdictions. What was particularly unique about this case's resolution was the necessity of combining multiple techniques, both old and new, Kramer explained. For the last 3 years, this group met nearly every month to discuss evidence, new techniques, and possible methods for solving the case. The team regularly consulted various labs across the country for potential advancements. Jackson has since issued a nationwide call to law enforcement agencies. If you have unsolved murders from the late 1980s through the late 1990s involving binding victims with their own clothing, sexual assault, execution-style shootings with .22 or .80 caliber weapons, or attempts to destroy evidence with fire, contact the Austin Police Department. There may be more Brashers victims who have never been identified. Mindy Montford, now senior counsel for the state attorney's ColdCase unit, worked on the yogurt shop case back in 2007 as an assistant Travis County district attorney. She made a promise to the families then that she would never abandon the case. She kept that promise. Her unit continues investigating whether Brashers was responsible for other violent crimes in Texas that remain unsolved. For Sean and Angie Ayers, the resolution of the case has been bittersweet. They finally have answers. They finally know who killed Amy and why she died. They know that in her final moments, 13-year-old Amy Ayers fought back against her attacker, scratching him, clawing at him, leaving the DNA evidence under her fingernails that would, 34 years later, identify her killer and bring justice not just for her, but for his other victims. "I've always been told that Amy fought fiercely for her life," Sean Ayers said at the press conference, his voice breaking. "Now we have proof. The last thing she did was fight. We're not finished. We will continue to fight for her and for other families." The Ayers family has committed to helping other families of unsolved homicide victims, using their experience and their platform to advocate for continued investigation of cold cases, for advances in forensic technology, and for the kind of relentless dedication that Detective Dan Jackson brought to the yogurt shop case. When asked what message he would convey to Amy if he could speak to her, Jackson paused thoughtfully before answering. "I'm sorry it took 34 years for you and your parents to receive this information, but good for you, girl, for scratching him. That's incredible, because that's what led us to this point today." There's something profound in that statement. Amy Ayers, in her final moments of life, fighting against a serial killer who had already murdered multiple victims and would go on to murder more, managed to leave behind the evidence that would eventually identify him. She couldn't save herself. She was 13 years old, overpowered by an experienced predator. But she could, and did, leave a clue. A scratch, DNA under her fingernails, a message from beyond the grave that said, "This is who did it. Find him. Stop him. Make sure justice is done." And 34 years later, that message was finally received. The yogurt shop case raises profound questions about our criminal justice system, about the tension between the urgent need for closure and the patient requirement of certainty. It reveals the dangers of coerced confessions, of circumstantial cases built on psychology rather than physical evidence, of convictions obtained through correlation rather than proof. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott were convicted because their confessions seemed to corroborate each other, because juries trust confessions, because everyone wanted the case to be solved so desperately that they were willing to overlook the absence of physical evidence. But the case also demonstrates the power of persistence, of scientific advancement, of investigators who refuse to accept convenient answers when those answers don't align with the evidence. Dan Jackson could have looked at the case file and decided it was hopeless. 34 years old, evidence degraded by fire, previous investigations that had resulted in wrongful convictions, a suspect who had been dead for over 2 decades. Many detectives would have focused on more solvable cases, on investigations where the perpetrator could actually be brought to trial and punished. Jackson didn't do that. He pursued the truth, wherever it led, even if that truth meant confirming the guilt of a man who would never stand trial, who would never face his victims' families in court, who would never spend a single day in prison for the yogurt shop murders because he'd taken his own life 26 years earlier. Why does that matter? Why invest thousands of hours of investigative work into solving a case when the perpetrator can never be prosecuted? It matters because the families deserve to know. It matters because the wrongfully convicted deserve vindication. It matters because there are other victims of Robert Eugene Brashers out there, other families who have spent decades wondering who killed their daughter, their sister, their mother, and those families deserve answers too. It matters because the truth has value in itself, independent of prosecution and punishment. It matters because a community that lived for 34 years believing a serial killer had struck their city and escaped justice can finally know that the case is solved, the monster is identified, and he will never kill again. The yogurt shop murders case closed on September 26, 2020, The investigation took 12,000 days. It consumed the careers of dozens of investigators. It resulted in wrongful convictions that robbed innocent men of years of their lives. It required advances in forensic science that didn't exist when the crime occurred. It took a detective who got shot in the line of duty and came back to work anyway, refusing to abandon the case even while recovering from devastating injuries. But in the end, justice was done. Not the justice of a courtroom trial and a guilty verdict. Robert Eugene Brashers escaped that when he took his own life in 1999. But the justice of truth, of identification, of confirmation, of families finally receiving answers to questions they'd carried for more than 3 decades. Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison are gone. They've been gone for 34 years. They never got to finish high school, never went to college, never fell in love, never had careers or children or the ordinary lives they deserved. They were stolen from the world by a monster who preyed on the vulnerable and destroyed everything he touched. But they were not forgotten. Their families kept their memories alive. Their community kept their case files open. Their evidence was preserved, protected, waiting for the day when science would advance far enough to reveal its secrets. And when that day came, Amy Ayers' final act of defiance, scratching her attacker, leaving his DNA under her fingernails, finally spoke across the decades and identified the man who had murdered her and her friends. This is the story of the Austin yogurt shop murders. This is the story of how 4 girls' lives were stolen and how, 34 years later, the truth finally emerged. This is the story of wrongful convictions and scientific redemption, of families who refused to give up, and a detective who refused to quit. This is the story of justice delayed, but not denied. If you made it to the end of this investigation with me, thank you. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with anyone who believes in the power of truth, in the importance of never giving up on cold cases, in the idea that every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from today? And what's your biggest takeaway from this case? For me, it's the reminder that evidence doesn't lie, that science advances, and that a determined investigator with access to the right tools can solve cases that once seemed impossible. The families of the yogurt shop murder victims have committed to helping other families of cold case victims. If you or someone you know has information about Robert Eugene Brashers or any unsolved cases that might be connected to him, contact the Austin Police Department's Cold Case Unit or the Texas Attorney General's office. Remember the names: Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison. 4 girls who deserved so much more than they got. 4 girls whose memory pushed investigators to never give up. 4 girls whose case, after 34 years, is finally closed. We will not forget.